I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome. Hello, and welcome back to the first regular episode of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club in several weeks. We have concentrated on all the authors who are nominated for the Agatha Awards at Malice Domestic this month. We are finally finished with all the interviews that we had done. We did 18 in 5 episodes. We're pooped.
Yes, we are. In a couple days from the time that this recording comes out, we will be at Malice Domestic.
Very excited.
Yes.
Back to our regular scheduled episodes. We do have a double episode this time. Today we speak to
Edward Humes and talk about his book, Burned, A Story of Murder and the Crime That Wasn't. But first,
we will talk to Lea Wait. Enjoy. We would like to welcome Lea Wait to our podcast. She is the author of the antique print, the Mainely Needlepoint, and several standalone novels, as well as some nonfiction work also. Welcome, Lea.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
How did you get started writing, and what drew you to the mystery genre?
I've been writing since I was about in second grade, and I discovered there were people who wrote those books in the library. I spent a lot of time there. My second grade teacher used to go and get me out of the library and say, Lea, when you grow up, you can be a writer. You can spend all your time in the library, but you have to finish second grade first. I thought, oh, I can be a writer. So I started in second grade telling everyone I was going to be a writer. Now, it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to write, I will admit. But I did the usual things. I was editor of my high school newspaper. I went on to college and majored as an undergraduate in English and in drama. And I wrote plays and poetry, all kinds of things you don't get paid much to write. And then my first post-college job was, believe it or not, as an executive speechwriter for AT&T, because they discovered that I could write dialogue. And then I went to graduate school at night and so forth and so on. So I worked for AT&T for a lot of years doing a lot of different kinds of all theoretically nonfiction writing. And then during that period of time, too, I adopted 4 children. I was a single parent, but I wanted to be a mother. So I adopted 4 older girls. I wrote a lot about adoption. So, of course, that was nonfiction, too. Then I guess I was probably in my 40s. My kids were teenagers and becoming totally impossible to deal with. So I turned to fiction. At the beginning, I wrote what we call now literary fiction, short stories and so forth, and had some published. But I really had trouble finishing an entire book. Plotting has always been a challenge for me. It still is. But in any case, a friend of mine said, well, why don't you write a mystery? Because you have a basic plot there. You have somebody die and you have to figure out who it is. And I actually hadn't read mysteries for many, many years, since I'd been in high school probably. So I sat down and I read about 200 mysteries. And I think back, I really did that. But I did. And I really had no idea that there were like 35 different subgenres of mysteries and so forth. And I learned that. And I also decided that if I were going to try to write one, my goal at that point being to write an entire book and just say, I can do it. I can turn out 300 pages on one subject. Then I decided to write a cozy or traditional mystery because I wouldn't have to do as much research about that. And I wrote Kill Me Quick Before I Die. It was rejected by 40 of the best agents out there. I put it in my bottom drawer because all the books on writing say you have to have an unpublished novel in your bottom drawer. I did. Then I actually got a wonderful buyout offer, and I was able to finally move to Maine full-time, which is what I wanted to do. When I got to Maine, I started writing historical novels, which was working out fine. And a couple of years later, my editor said, by the way, have you ever written anything for adults? And I said, well, yeah, I did write this mystery once. And I told her a little bit about it. And she said, well, why don't you read through it, edit it a little bit if you need, and then and send it to me. But if anyone says in New York, send me a manuscript, you do. So I sent it to her 2 weeks later. A year later, I got a call from a woman who explained that she was the editorial director of Scribner, which I didn't even know was connected to my editor, and that they wanted to buy it. The only problem was that they absolutely hated the title, so they wanted to call it Shadows at the Fair. And by the way, when it was the next one in the series going to be ready. And that's how I became a mystery writer.
Wow.
Shadows at the Fair was a finalist for a Best First Agatha the next year. It was the first in the Shadows Antique Print Mystery Series.
And what year was that?
That would have been 2002, I believe, when that was published. My first book for young people was published in 2001.
Well, speaking of the Antique Print series, we really enjoy those. Have you completed that series?
I think I have. If you read the series, you know that there is sort of an underlying theme there. And keep in mind, this was the first series I wrote, so it's a little bit like my life. I was an antique dealer, an antique print dealer. In fact, I'm fourth generation antique dealer, so I grew up with history and with antiques. I live in a house built in 1774, which I even write about in one of those books. The underlying thing was that I have a 38-year-old protagonist who is a widow and who wants to adopt as a single parent. As the series goes on, she makes that decision. There is this man in her life who doesn't want children, so that's basically a conflict. And I resolved that, I thought, in the last book that I wrote, which was Shadows on a Morning in Maine. I thought I'd solved the problem. Then I got a lot of notes from people saying, oh no, want to know more. Considering that at that point I was writing 2 other series, I really didn't have time to do it. So at this point, I think probably that one is the last. That'll be an 8-book series. And I only left 1 or 2 unresolved issues, and they were pretty minor. Most people don't even recognize them. So I think that series is at an end.
Well, you are a very prolific writer and put out several books a year. How long does it take you to write a book, or do you write several at the same time? And if so, how do you keep track of the storyline, which you already alluded to that you have trouble with plotting?
I have trouble with plotting. Characters are fine. Setting, I love. Those plots. Anyway, I don't write more than 1 book at a time, although I have been known to be writing 1 book during the day and researching another one at night. It really does depend on the kind of book. I have spent as long as a year researching one of my historical books. My historical novels, which are in a sense my more serious work, most of them are aimed at relatively young people, although an awful lot of adults read them, but they are officially for ages like 8 to 14. They are all absolutely accurate, and in fact, they have real people in them, and not George Washington type people, just ordinary people who live in a town, and most of them are set in the same town in Maine in different years, because I had the idea that places stay the same. Rivers, mountains, we mess them up sometimes, but basically they are what they are. And here in Maine, of course, we have a lot of even buildings that are a couple hundred years old. My own house is over 200 years old. So some things don't change, but the way we live in those houses and the way we use the rivers and the mountains and so forth has changed over the years. So I thought it would be interesting to take one location and write a series of books that were all set there. They're connected by the location. Most series, of course, are connected by characters. I've written 6 books that are historical novels and that are set at all of them at least partially in Wiscasset, Maine. The earliest one is set in 1777. The latest one is set during the first 2 weeks of the Civil War. They require a lot of research. Contemporary adult books don't require as much research, and as I am getting older and writing more and being asked to write more, I write them faster. In fact, I just finished a draft manuscript yesterday. After I talk to you, I'll be going through an editing. And that will be the next Needlepoint book. They take me 3 or 4 months to write, again, depending on other obligations and commitments and so forth. They don't require as much research as the historicals.
Do you write your title or your story first?
Oh, the story, definitely. The Needlepoint series particularly has all these punny titles. I have an editor who absolutely adores puns. I came up with a couple of them, but the one I'm writing now will be the 9th one in the series. It is called Thread and Buried. I would say my editor probably came up with 2/3 of the titles. I will say, here are some suggested titles, and I'll put down 4, 5, 6, 7, and he will put a big X over them and say, I think the title's going to be, and he will title. I would say of all my books, and I have 27, 28 books now out, I would say I probably have titled maybe half of them, and not even sure about that. Definitely the book comes first. And I do keep track, by the the way, with all the series. I have what I call my Bible. I have a notebook on my desk. I'm looking at it at this moment. All elegant, has a red leather cover and everything because I use it a lot. But I have in that book all of the characters in the 3 mystery series that I've been writing, all the details about them, so that I don't have to look at how old somebody is or what color eyes they have or whatever. And that really is an enormous help when I'm writing.
We really enjoy the needlepoint series you do, and actually all 3 of us do needlepoint. We could definitely identify with the series. Do you do needlepoint? And if you do, when do you find time?
I have a confession to make. I don't do needlepoint. Don't tell anybody. My editor in New York wanted a series with needlepoint in the background, and I sort of went, needlepoint? I have a sister who does needlepoint. I'm familiar with needlepoint, but I had never really done it myself. I knit. Actually, I don't even knit very much, so much writing recently. And I got a cat. Combination of all those things doesn't work well. He really wanted needlepoint, so I thought that, okay, I compromised by having Angie, my major character, who really doesn't do needlepoint. She's sort of learning it, depending on the book that you're reading. I also have in there about antique needlepoint and restoration and so forth, and that was something that I knew something about because I was an antique dealer. So I grew up with samplers and pieces of needlepoint that I saw at antique shows. It was not something I specialized in. I specialized in prints. My grandmother specialized in dolls and toys. So I could go through my family of all antique dealers. At least I was familiar enough with antique needlepoint so that I felt I could write about it. And of course, as you know, since you've read both series, I put epigraphs at the beginning of the chapters. I'm able to sneak in little bits and pieces of information about the past, needlepoint prints, or in the Maine Murder series, which only has 1 book out in it. That's about household hints and recipes and so forth at the beginning of each chapter. So that's always fun to do.
Well, that leads us directly to our next question. Where do you get all of those historical quotes?
Well, keep in mind, I write historical novels too. So I have one whole room that is just books that I've used for reference in the books that I've written. And keep in mind, antique dealers going back 4 generations. So we have a lot of old books in this house. Basically, just collected all the ones that had anything to do with the topic I was looking for and started borrowing from them. Also, there is a wonderful small museum up here in Maine in Biddeford. It has a collection of needlepoint done by girls in northern New England in the 19th century. And I went and I saw what they had in addition to what I had known about and seen at antique shows. And I'm on the list for a lot of antique journals and magazines and so forth. Often I'll see samplers or pieces of needlepoint advertised. Just steal the information that's in the auction journal or in the antique magazine. So I get them from all different places. There also are books that different historical societies have put out on needlepoint from, let's say, in Delaware or in Washington City or in Ohio and so forth. I have collected those over the past several years and have several shelves of books on antique needlepoint. The information at the beginning of the chapter comes from all those varying places, basically pulling it all together. One of the challenges, by the way, is that because, first of all, I know that a lot of it was done in cross-stitch, although not as much as a lot of people assume. So it isn't needlepoint technically, it is cross-stitch. But also, it's interesting that a lot of these young ladies basically copied each other, so that there are some quotations on samplers that I run into 10, 20, 30 times. I keep thinking, man, I need a new one, because my editor will not want the same quotation at the beginning of 2 chapters. And now that I'm writing the 9th book in the series, and there's about 40 or 50 chapters in each one, that's a lot of different pieces of needlepoint.
In Thread Herrings, I like the historical facts you had about the foundling hospitals in 1700. How do you research these kinds of historical facts?
Well, it all really depends. I keep my eyes open at all times because of my background and the fact that I was very involved as an advocate for adoption and foster care, especially of older children when I was younger. Anything that has to do with orphans or anything, my ears just prick up. That's also included in the book that I call Sarah's book that's in the series, something that I discovered and I needed to put in. The one that is in thread herrings. I really found out about that because there was an exhibit of some of those pieces of needlepoint and the little fabric treasures that were connected to the files at the London Foundling Hospital, and they came as a touring exhibit to Williamsburg several years ago. Unfortunately, I could not get to Williamsburg at that time. I certainly read all that I could about it. I was fascinated by the whole thing. Then I started doing research on my own. That's where that particular idea came from. There just always are things out there if you keep your eyes open, and then you have to dig a lot further.
Do you have any new books or events that you would like our listeners to know about?
Well, I just happen to have a new book. It came out last week. It is a standalone. It is an historical mystery, which is the first time I have written an historical mystery for adults, and it's called Justice and Mercy, and it is set in New York State, not Maine, and it is set at a farm basically on the banks of the Erie.